It's pretty amazing how easily we get swept up by the idea of extinct animals coming back, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. Things like woolly mammoths, dodos. There's a real pull there.
And that's where this news about Colossal Biosciences and their dire wolf pups comes in. It hit the headlines.
Right. Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi, the names alone,
Yeah,
very evocative, especially with the Game of Thrones link.
definitely. But we wanted to dig into what's really going on behind those names and the hype. We've been looking at a great piece in Vox that unpacks it.
Yeah, it does a good job. So for everyone listening, that's our plan today. Figure out what these pups actually are and what this tells us about de-extinction more broadly.
Okay, so first things first. When you hear dire wolf pups, you think Ice Age megafauna, right? Big, ancient predators.
That's the instant image, yeah.
But the Vox article makes it clear pretty quickly that's not what these are. They're genetically modified hybrids.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
They started with modern gray wolf cells. They didn't, resurrect ancient dire wolf DNA directly.
And they were carried by a domestic dog surrogate mother.
That's right. So the Vox article's comparison to designer dogs is actually pretty apt in some ways.
So Colossal took gray wolf cells, tweaked some genes to get certain traits, maybe the look, the size associated with dire wolves.
That seems to be the approach. They identified some genetic differences, used gene editing tools like CRISPR, and then used cloning tech to create embryos.
Which were then implanted into the domestic dog surrogates.
Wow. It's a complex process.
So the Game of Thrones names, the whole dire wolf angle, it's more like clever branding than scientific accuracy.
It certainly helps capture the public imagination. You can't deny that. It leverages that cultural familiarity.
But scientifically, we need to look past that branding, right? Colossal has bigger goals than just these pups.
Exactly. They talk about woolly mammoths, dodos, the Tasmanian tiger, a whole range of extinct species.
And the process for any of these, as the Vox piece lays out, is incredibly complex. It starts with the DNA itself.
Which is often degraded, fragmented, especially in older specimens. Just sequencing the extinct animal's genome is a massive hurdle.
Right. Then you compare that sequence to a living relative, like an elephant for a mammoth, or a gray wolf for a dire wolf.
Find the key genetic differences, the genes that made the extinct species unique. Or at least the ones you think made it unique.
And then you try to edit those specific genes into the cells of the living relative.
Using tools like CRISPR, yeah. And the final step, in theory, is cloning. Taking those edited cells, creating embryos, and finding a surrogate mother to carry them.
It's a huge chain of biological and technical challenges.
Definitely. And bringing it back to these specific pups, the Vox article highlights just how much genetic difference we're actually talking about.
Colossal mentioned making about 20 genetic edits.
Around that number, yeah. They targeted about 14 genes, making roughly 20 changes to gray wolf cells.
Which, sounds like quite a lot when you first hear it. 20 edits.
But here's where the perspective from Nick Rollins, the paleontologist quoted in the article, is really crucial.
What did he say?
Well, he points out that a wolf genome has billions of DNA letters. Billions.
Okay.
And even if Colossal is right that gray wolves and dire wolves are, say, 99.5% similar genetically,
That still leaves
millions of individual differences, millions of base pairs that are different between the two.
So making 20 edits, even if they're targeting genes for, like, coat color or size.
It's a tiny fraction of the total genetic difference. As Rollins says, it's still very much a gray wolf.
Just a gray wolf with a few specific traits maybe nudged in a certain direction.
Exactly. The article suggests the focus was likely on traits that are visible, maybe more thrilling for public perception. The white fur, the larger potential size.
Makes sense from a PR standpoint.
Yeah.
But it really drives home that this isn't true de-extinction, it's modification.
It's creating something novel based on an existing species.
So why? What's the bigger motivation here, according to the Vox piece?
Well, there are a few layers. One argument is that pushing the boundaries with these ambitious projects helps advance the underlying technologies, gene editing, cloning, synthetic biology.
Okay, so the idea is that even if mammoth de-extinction is a long shot, the tools developed along the way could be useful elsewhere.
Precisely. Especially in conservation. Imagine using advanced gene editing to help endangered species, maybe introduce genetic diversity into a bottleneck population, or engineer resistance to a deadly disease.
That sounds potentially very valuable. Does Colossal do work like that too?
They do. The article mentions they've actually cloned critically endangered red wolves, which could genuinely aid conservation efforts if done carefully.
Right. So that raises the obvious question. if the tech can help existing endangered species, why pour so much effort and funding into bringing back extinct ones? Why not focus entirely on conservation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? One perspective, maybe, is that the sheer difficulty of de-extinction acts as a powerful catalyst. It forces innovation in a way that perhaps more incremental conservation tech work might not.
Like a moonshot project for genetics. Pushing the limits might lead to breakthroughs you wouldn't get otherwise.
Possibly. It's a high-risk, potentially high-reward approach to technological development. Of course, Colossal also talks about wanting to fix extinction to restore ecosystems.
Yeah, they mentioned returning the dire wolf to its rightful place.
But as the article points out, what is its rightful place now? The ice-ave ecosystem it inhabited is gone, vanished thousands of years ago.
So putting these modified wolves out there wouldn't be restoring anything ecologically speaking. The context is completely different.
Exactly. It sounds nice, but the ecological argument doesn't really hold water for the dire wolf case.
Which brings us to the ethics of it all. The Vox piece definitely raises some serious concerns.
Huge concerns. First, there's the welfare of the animals directly involved. The surrogate mothers, the domestic dogs in this case, undergo invasive procedures.
And cloning itself often has very low success rates, right? High rates of miscarriage, developmental problems.
Exactly. There's potential for significant suffering and loss of life just in the process of trying to create these animals.
And then there's that bigger ethical worry, the moral hazard idea.
Explain that a bit.
The fear that if people think we can just bring species back later, it might weaken the resolve to protect them now. Like, oh, don't worry, if the northern white rhino goes extinct, we'll just de-extinct it eventually.
Which is a dangerous way of thinking. The article even notes that some political figures seemed interested in this tech, potentially as a reason to relax protections for currently endangered species.
That's deeply concerning. It treats extinction as reversible, which really isn't, not in a true ecological sense.
And even if you successfully create a healthy clone, reintroducing it is another massive challenge. These animals are raised in captivity.
They don't have the learned behaviors, the survival skills. They might have hidden health issues from the cloning process itself, sticking them back in the wild. It's often not feasible.
So you have to weigh the potential future benefits of the technology against the very real costs and ethical issues for the animals being used in the research today.
Yeah. And beyond the broader ethics, the Vox article gets into the specifics of commercial interests and the welfare of these particular animals.
Right, because ultimately these pups are creations of a private company. They're proprietary.
They're living technology in a way, developed to refine gene editing techniques.
And the article points out that animal welfare regulations, like the U.S. Animal Welfare Act, have limitations, especially concerning research animals. This gives companies a lot of leeway.
So we're talking about confinement for surrogates, invasive procedures for embryo transfer, the inherent risks of cloning failures.
All of that. And even for the pups that are born seemingly healthy, like these three, there are potential long-term health unknowns associated with being cloned and genetically modified, even with relatively few edits.
Who's responsible if they develop problems down the line?
That's a thorny issue. Ultimately, the responsibility lies with the creators, and then there's the specter of commercial exploitation.
What do you mean? Like put them in zoos?
Potentially, or more. The article references George Church, one of Colossal's co-founders, suggesting possible uses for hypothetical de-extincted mammoths, tourism, meat, hair, even legal ivory.
Wow. That shifts it completely away from conservation and towards, well, commercial products.
It becomes a different kind of enterprise entirely. The article does acknowledge the wow factor, the sort of technological marvel of these pups. They released videos, and they are undeniably cute.
Yeah, you see the videos, the headlines. It's easy to get caught up.
But the article quickly pivots to the reality. These animals are living in relative isolation, outside a natural wolf pack structure. They can't live like wild wolves.
And wild gray wolves need huge territories, right? Hundreds of square miles sometimes.
Exactly. Compared to the 2,000-acre preserve Colossal has mentioned for them, it's just not comparable. It raises questions about their quality of life long term.
So the final takeaway from the Vox piece seems pretty clear.
Yeah, it concludes this is really more about invention, about creating something new driven by human goals, rather than true de-extinction or even conservation in the traditional sense.
So wrapping this up, the main point seems to be these dire wolf pups are fascinating, a real feat of genetic engineering, but they aren't resurrected dire wolves.
Not in the way most people would imagine, no. They're a novel experiment using gray wolves as a base.
And it really forces us to think critically about what de-extinction means, what the goals are, and crucially, what the ethical trade-offs might be.
Absolutely. Just because we can develop a technology doesn't automatically mean we should or that it's the best path forward. We need to consider the consequences.
Which leaves us with a pretty big question to ponder, doesn't it? Thinking about our history with animals, how we've used them, impacted them. Are we really ready, ethically, to wield the power to create entirely new forms of life or modified life like this responsibly?
That's the question to keep asking, I think. It goes way beyond these pups.
Click like and subscribe to the Unlock Your Mind channel.